The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed are the speaker's own and does not represent legal or accounting advice or counsel and should not be seen as such. The material and information presented here is for general information purposes only, a conversation. We make no promises or assertions on how this information will impact your business, your personal life, or financial well-being. The information relayed does not imply endorsement or offer opposition to any specific organization, product, or services. Welcome to Shift. I'm your host, Lori Power, and I'm looking forward to our conversation. So I'm really pleased that you could join today, Jesse. We've known each other a while and I like your story. I want to today go into talking about succession on the family enterprise and how that has shaped where you're going with your business and how you do your business.
Sure. Yeah. And Lori, of course, thanks for reaching out. Always appreciate reconnecting with you. So my name is Jesse Hill. I'm the president and owner of Tier 3 IT Solutions, and we are a managed IT services provider in the greater Edmonton area. As Lori mentioned, we're talking about succession. So I'm second generation in the business. And my parents started the company in September of 1990. So, sometimes I reflect back and think, what were you thinking starting a computer company in 1990? Like the internet wasn't a thing yet, and but it's grown and changed and evolved over the years to what it is today.
When your parents started the company, though, was it an internet company or had they started with something else in mind and did it evolve over time to go with the technology?
Yeah, so the internet really was not a thing. It was not available at that time. Even the idea of local networking, of sharing applications and data between computers was not really standard in most businesses. So it was really at that point, individual computers doing, individual tasks, and then of course has gone through every iteration and evolution since. Which sometimes it feels like we've come a long way with computers, but then sometimes I also think and realize that, I mean, we'll probably use computers for the foreseeable future, the next 100, 200, 500 years. So we're kind of still very much at the infancy of what technology is going to look like in our lives and in our businesses. And, I tell my staff all the time that the work and the solutions that we provide today are different than what we did 3 years ago and are different than what we will do 3 years from now.
And how true is that? Because I'm sure when your parents started the company and they were working with people who had computers, we were saving onto a floppy disk or printing out and then faxing, right? That information sharing was very cumbersome and very manually related to the tool that is the computer.
Mhm.
I've heard you say before you were born into the business and, you can't quite remember a time when you weren't part of the business. How has that shaped you? Did you ever think that you weren't going to be part of the business? Was there a time in your life where you were like, yeah, that's your business, but I'm going off and doing something else? How did that work growing up with entrepreneurs and having the family enterprise?
Yeah, so I do remember, being a young child, working in the business and building computers and troubleshooting problems with old DOS-based applications and Windows 3.1 and growing up through that. And I, I I guess I personally always felt like I was, interested in the business. As I've grown and matured, I've come to realize, I really appreciate that we're in the technology space, but for me, the interest has always been the business component of it. And so I your question about how it's impacted me, every once in a while we'll be sitting in a team meeting now and I'll have to kind of defer to the team and remind them that this is the only business that I've ever really worked for. So, an example is when we go through our recruitment and our screening and our hiring process. I've had many people that we've brought on into the team comment that our process was unique or different or unusual. Sometimes they might even say, and I'm just kind of like, yeah, I don't know. I mean, this is just what I've learned over time, looking at mistakes that we've made and things that we could learn from, and, changing and iterating and trying to improve as we go. So I personally always felt connected to the business. It's so much different than it was, even 10 years ago. So as far as what succession looks like for me, which I know is something that we're going to get into, it's a totally different discussion probably than what it was between myself and my parents.
And we'll get into that a little bit because you've hit on to something that makes me very curious. You said you're interested in the business side of things, not necessarily what the business does. That speaks to me between the lines that what did your parents do to prepare you to have that business stratagem in your mindset as they were moving through their business? Like there would be something I can say, I know what I do with my kids, like, I'll well, they're not kids anymore, but with my boys as they were growing up, they would ask me things about being an entrepreneur. They would ask me things about running a business and how it's very different from what they were experiencing outside with their friend group. So, what kinds of things did your parents perhaps instill in you that made it different on how you look at the business?
Well, I think maybe what I saw was that, as a business owner, and my father was the one that was primarily, in the business, or that I saw in the business. And what I saw was that he got to do a lot of different things. Some days he was in, hands deep in a computer solving a problem. Other times he was meeting with people, doing the sales and the account management side of things. His formal training up to that point was a little bit more on the finance side of things, and so I got to see, how he was managing that, and he helped us when we were young kids to understand, um, the power of leverage, of and not just leverage of money, but leverage of time, and leverage of, what you can accomplish as a part of a team rather than, working on your own. And so, yeah, I would say that's probably the biggest thing, was that I just saw that every day he got to do something different, and there was always an interesting problem to solve. Sometimes it was technology, sometimes it was people, sometimes it was finance. And I guess I just naturally was drawn to that.
When you first started talking about taking over from your father, what did that conversation look like? Did he initiate it? Was it a bit unspoken, but somebody has to say it out loud? I'm very curious as to how that conversation first started and evolved.
It was a tricky conversation, I think, for sure. And, truthfully, I look back at it and I go, man, I probably didn't approach that in the best way. uh, thinking about if my kids approached me, what would I expect from them based on what I learned? And so, right, I mean, I worked in the business in many different capacities, going, junior high and high school. Like, I would go and work after school, and that was what I did. Had a couple of, other jobs, in the summer, and those types of things. Um, but I knew that I was going to work in the business, and I made the decision to go to Grant McEwen and do some schooling around, business management, business operations. And when I came out of the program, I feel like it was just, I feel like we both just understood that, okay, I'm now going to, start taking over more responsibility. And in hindsight, I now realize that my dad was fairly young when when that happened. He would have been, oh, I don't think he was quite 50 yet.
Oh
And,
my.
and and of course, I had some ambition and some energy and probably a lack of awareness around my attitude. And I I do recall that it seems like we agreed that there was going to be a transition, but I think that we disagreed on how quickly it would occur and really what the end result was and when that would happen. And so, we had a couple years where, we had some pretty heated discussions, and eventually we got to the point where we realized that really only one of us could be in charge. And he trusted in me and allowed me to step in and start doing that, at least the way
Well,
I.
that's you know what, that's it's incredible because we hear a lot of stories on the other side, right? Where somebody isn't willing to allow the new generation to step in and do those things. Did you seek outside assistance in working through that transition time period, or were you able to work it out yourselves in a family manner?
Yeah, so I mean, if we were to look at when I came out of, college, and when they were out of the business, when I had, finished the acquisition, it was 10 years out of college before I acquired the business.
Yeah.
And so, there was that period of time where I was essentially managing and operating the business on their behalf. And so I think that gave both sides, for me, it gave me the opportunity to actually learn about what the business was and what it was capable of and what the results that it was generating, actually were. And it gave them an opportunity to, you know, kind of watch me and really assess if I was ready and if I was, capable of taking on, all of the responsibility that came with it. So, the first 2 or 3 years, no, probably 3 to 5 years was a little bit, you know, tricky. And then the next 5 years was pretty good. And then that's when I came to them and said, all right, I've been running this thing. It's you're 10 years beyond where I started this thing. Here's what I think, the next step would look like. And that's when we started talking about, the acquisition and moving them on to their next, stage.
You say two things that gives me pause for consideration, and that would be, do you think that you had the space available to fail in a safe environment to learn and get your feet under you during that stretch of time?
Mm, 100%.
The
Yeah.
other thing is I think a misnomer very often when it comes to succession planning is when you talk about that 10-year scope, that successful transitions are usually a 10-year scope
Mhm,
of time. And very often when we're in business, we think, okay, well, now I'm ready to sell. Something has triggered me, whether that's, a death, a divorce,
mhm,
a disability. And I think, okay, well, I'm going to sell my business in 6 months, or I'm going to be out of here in the next year. Who's buying it? What's that look like? Do they have room to fail in that safe space? So
mhm.
that 10 years that you mentioned to me, it just falls in line with most successful succession plans do take time
Yeah.
to evolve and grow and be able to take over. What did next look like for your parents after having their speak often about identity, right? And I'll pick on myself and say, you know what, my business is part of a huge part of my identity. So what did identity and next look like for your parents when they left from your perspective?
Sorry, I just want to ask because I realized I didn't answer your question about whether got outside help.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there are a couple things in there. So one of the things that I remember early on was we attended a seminar or whatever, a presentation from a business brokerage, somebody that had the big pitch about how they help these family businesses exit and make all this money. And I remember my dad and I went to it, and we're like, okay, this is interesting. Like, let's talk to them. So we talked to them. We showed them all our financials. Told them the story, and the guy who gave the presentation about how they do this great job of telling these stories and selling them as businesses, you know, he looked at us and said, "Yeah, sorry, you're not saleable." And we went, "Oh,
What?
tell me what you're talking about." And he came and the points that he made was we weren't like a really unique business. We weren't like this regional powerhouse. We were just big enough that the average person, couldn't go to their bank, and take out the money that they would need to buy us, but we were too small for, like a really big, you know, acquirer to care about us. And so that was hard to hear, but it also helped me understand, okay, if I want to take this on from my parents, I want them to have, some kind of, exit that is, valuable to them. And also I need to be thinking about how I'm building the business and building value, for further down the road. So that was, a little bit demoralizing, but also very instructive. I also, over the years, worked with a number of different business coaches and consultants, some, independent style ones, some, kind of more recognized brands, those types of things. And every time, your question about did I have room to fail and those types of things, even though it was a business that my parents owned, and I was operating, I had the opportunity to say, hey, I would like to invest in this program. And I've heard people say that owning a business is the most expensive education that you'll ever have, and it's 100% true. Going to Grant MacEwan was the cheap part of the education. um, it's the 10 years afterwards where, try and fail, try and fail, try and fail, that, if you look back, if I went back and figured out the cost of the time that I lost, it's, well, I guess I didn't lose it. It's all part of what built, to where we are today. Um, and then, of course, when we went through the transition, we had to bring in our, lawyers and accountants and, get everybody on board. And I think one of the other things I learned there was that even though we might have an agreement on how things should go, well, the accountants have something to say and the lawyers have something to say, and then the government has something to say. And so you've got to make sure that really the five of you are all happy with how things go,
Yeah.
not just, between the seller and the buyer.
And it's the added stress that if you don't have the timeline that you have put for yourselves when you did it, if you're considering that I'm going to get out in 6 months to a year and you have to satisfy all of those viewpoints,
Yeah.
it's enough to make a lot of business owners, more than 70%, throw up their hands and say, it's not worth it. I'm just going to stay where I am.
Yeah, and I mean, it took us 18 months to go through all the legal restructuring and all of the things that we needed to do to be able to allow the accountants to do their part, to do, the next part. And even that, like you say, I mean, a lot of people think, oh, I'm going to sell it, I'm going to be out of my business next year. Well, they didn't have to find a buyer. Like, I already knew how to run the business. I already had control of everything, and it still took that long. Um, You asked, the next question was about,
What did next look like for your parents
mm,
once the deal was done? And you don't have to elaborate where you're not comfortable, but I want to move into how that shapes you on your thinking going forward.
mhm.
Because I can see a few things already that has shaped your thinking on the process, but I'd like to know a little bit more about what did next look like for your parents?
Yeah. So my father, so when we got to that point, my mother had not been involved in the day-to-day business for, 15 years. And so for her, there wasn't much of a transition. So it was really about my father. And at that point, his primary activity in the business was being like taking care of the books. And so in our purchase agreement, I, had a clause in there that he was going to continue to be my bookkeeper. So he just basically switched from being an owner to being an employee. Obviously we made sure that he didn't have any responsibility for anything. And so he was kind of behind the scenes, didn't have to answer to, any, staff or vendors or clients. And because we had had that 10 years leading up to it, um, he already was, kind of in that phase anyways. And it's one of the things I remember was, when I started running the business, everybody that worked there had been hired and trained by him. And then as I, started taking on more responsibility, then all of a sudden there was a point where I started doing all of the hiring and training and onboarding and management. And that I would say is like a really clear line where there was a certain point where all of a sudden, a third and then a half and then two-thirds of the staff were my staff as opposed to his staff. And so even though I didn't own the business at that point, it's still like the general feeling was, okay, well, I mean, he's the one that signed the agreement, so he's my boss, right?
Right.
Gary's the shareholder. Um, and so yeah, so even to this day, I mean, like I finished the acquisition many years ago. My father still, works in the business, doing our books, and when we're doing renovations and those types of things, he does all that. It keeps him active. He doesn't have a real strict deadline on anything, so he's got that flexibility.
Nice. You almost read my mind there when I was going to ask about the employees during the transition. Very often, we also hear nebulously out there in the mysterious they world about employees who transition in the family enterprise. And
Yeah.
you had hit on that there was a time where they were all your father's employees, hired and trained, and then that slowly transitioned into yours. Did you have any feedback, flack, maybe a word to use, any kind of socially hard time moving into your role as it applied to governing and managing your staff?
Again, kind of going back to my experience, when I started really managing the business, 22, 23 years old, and even though I wasn't making all of the decisions right then, I was managing, people who in some cases were 20 years older than I was. And I don't recall ever, hearing or having any debates with anybody about it, but there definitely were times that it was apparent that, the respect or you know, the trust wasn't there yet, because I was, the boss's son. And so I always was very careful about my not appearance, but my conduct at work. I always tried to make sure that, I wouldn't ask anyone to do something that I wouldn't do myself. I always made sure, if there was something that we needed to account for, that I was putting my hand up and, taking the blame and, participating and contributing, at a very high level. So that, it's kind of that lead by example, show them that you're part of the team, type of approach. And for the most part, it worked well.
And it creates a great company culture, and I can say that from the outside looking in and having known you for a long time, that is a bit of a secret ingredient to your good culture that you have with your staff and that retention that you're able to sustain. Now, you have over the years now acquired or purchased businesses to pull in.
Mhm.
How has your experience colored your conduct when you're buying business? Because now you're the third party purchaser.
Yeah. Yeah, so we made, probably our most significant acquisition, was back in 2018, and acquired another IT company. And at the time, it was, basically a 50% growth to our overall business by combining the two. And that owner had a very different style and approach than what I had. And not just in terms of employees, but in terms of relationships with clients. And, I guess I go back to when I, started taking over, our business. I probably thought that I could do more than I actually was capable of. And in some areas, I moved faster than I should have, and others slower than I should have. And I mean, truthfully, if we were to go back and think about the advice that people gave me, right? You and I were in, a networking group at the time, and there was advice that I was given that I heard and didn't follow, and then 2 years later, I went, man, I should have done what they said. But every time we've done it, we've just learned something else. Um, we actually just went through an exercise, last year and beginning of this year, where I was exploring another acquisition. And as we went through it, I did listen to the outside people, and ultimately we went, it's just not it's just not right. It might look good to have this, bigger thing, and, these other, services and geography and all those types of things, but it's going to be really messy, and it's going to take our focus off of all the good things that we're doing. And, sometimes being bigger just isn't necessarily the answer, or it's not the right way to do it.
I love those learnings. I really do. And when it comes time and it's your turn to consider your succession plan, two questions on that. Do you make succession planning part of the strategic business plan overall? And then I would like to delve into a little bit more about what is your takeaway? What's the one thing you're going to make sure you do when it's time for you to be succeeded?
Yeah. Well, so I mean, succession, I guess I'm not thinking of it in terms of an exit right now. But we did change up our management team and our org chart last year, specifically so that other people can start taking on more of those responsibilities and be, accountable to the day-to-day operations and the functioning of the business. Partly because we've gotten to a point where I need to be able to focus on other activities, but also partly because, I mean, there's a lot of people out there that are smarter and better at and more energized by managing those things than what I am. And so I wouldn't say that I've formally made succession planning a part of, our, business, planning and operations, but I feel like we're taking steps in that direction where, developing that team has become much more important to me. I think really just realizing that, like, there's a lot of the work that we do as business owners where it's like, okay, we just got to work hard and pay the bills and deliver the service. And then hopefully we get to a point where we've figured some things out and we've got a business model that's working. And I feel like I'm at the point now where I'm going, okay, now I need to, train and empower and support other people to, advance themselves and, be able to grow into or even grow out of, our business and do something great for themselves in whatever their next step is. And so, we're focusing a lot more on people now than we probably have, ever in the past.
Very nice. It's the insurance person in me that says, "What's the contingency plan? What happens if something happens to Jesse? What happens to the business
Yeah.
then?"
Yeah.
That's where the real strategy comes into, will the business be able to succeed, not succession, but succeed if there is a need for that contingency plan?
Yeah, and we do. I mean, we incorporate some of that into our like incident response and disaster planning types of sessions. So, as an example, we in the fall we got our team together and we ran a little simulation of, hey, we had this big cyber attack against our business, and we had this outside company basically painting this scenario of this really bad thing that was happening. And they said, so they went through and told the whole story about how bad it was. And they said, and oh, by the way, Jesse's on an airplane to Japan. He's unavailable for, the next 14 hours. And so I literally closed my laptop, got up and walked out of the room, and they were all just like, oh, we gotta do this on our own. And so, we're doing more of those types of things, which might be a little bit more tactical than strategic. But for sure, when they're all sitting in the room and they go, okay, we have to figure this out. And I would way rather they're figuring it out in practice than in real life.
Well,
Um,
it's that safe spot to fail, isn't it?
yeah, yeah. Yeah, as far as, in the big picture business stuff, yes, we absolutely have some contingencies in place and some protections and coverages and, those types of things. But I mean, let's face it, we're a small business. I mean, it would be a little bit messy for a little while. But I do believe that we've got enough people that know what's happening and our outside partners that, are able to help out with the different business areas if they need it.
Nice. Now I'm going to take you through this forward thinking and say, let's shoot out 20 years. And now it's your time to think about your 10-year horizon and your experiences that you've had, not just in taking over the family enterprise, but in buying and acquiring businesses during the career. You have made your company robust. It is even more than what it is right now today, with great people and good culture and excellent business ethics. But now it's time for you to consider your next after the business. What's your one learning that you're going to hold true? Like, that's your rod of steel, and I'm not letting it go because this has to happen based on your experiences and your learning from a lifetime of being in this business.
I think having that clear transition point is probably the biggest thing. I think to a client of ours who recently got acquired by one of their, vendor partners, and, they signed this multi-year, agreement, and I've got a peer group that I'm in, and one of the guys got an offer to acquire his business, and it was like a 10-year, process to sell it to this other group. And I just went, like, if you're gonna do it, just get it done, and help with the transition, but you got to move on. And so I suppose if I was making that decision right now, I'd be looking to make sure that we can clearly transition at a certain date, and I can move on and stop thinking and worrying and committing any time and effort to it.
And get on to next.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And then of course in our business, I mean, it's just so relationship driven. Even though, I mean, we're an IT company, people probably think, oh, it's you're just doing support tickets, or managing backups or whatever. We really believe that what we do is we help businesses achieve more through technology. And so um, if I was going to exit, going to transition ownership, we need to make sure that it's to somebody or to a group that believes the same things that we believe. And I think that's the hardest part to figure out. Um, so
Because you can't just tell somebody that you have a values match. You have to show it. It
yeah,
has to be proven.